So let me turn it over to Johnathan and Kelly. Johnathan is our presenter for today. I'm sorry that Shilpa couldn't make it because she had a family emergency, but you're in great hands with Johnathan. He's been a master gardener since 2008. Just a reminder to everyone to turn off your cameras because we are going to be recording and to stay muted. So let me turn it over to Johnathan and Kelly.
Thank you, Paula. Let me introduce Kelly. Kelly is Master Gardener class of 2018. She is going to be the chat monitor for the talk. So if you do have questions that come up, then put them in the chat, send them to Kelly. I think that's it. Kelly, anything else? Okay, I'm Johnathan Propp. I'm Master Gardener class of 2008. Just a few words about the Master Gardeners. We are a volunteer arm of the UC Cooperative Extension, which is based out of UC Davis. And there's Master Gardeners in all the counties of California. And we basically exist to help people learn how to garden. We do a lot of classes. We do technical consultations. We work with a lot of the community gardens in the two counties and a lot of other gardening projects. If you're interested in becoming a master gardener, we have a training class every 2 years, the even years, January through March. So the one just occurred this year. The next one will be in 2024. And it's a very rigorous, basically university level training in all aspects of gardening. Okay, so we're going to be talking about edible food growing in the fall. And here's our agenda for today. Microclimates, and then what to plant and when, soil care, and pest management. So first, a little bit about our weird and wonderful microclimates here in the Bay Area. I am known as the weather nerd of the San Francisco, San Mateo County Gardeners. And when we have the training class every 2 years, I teach the segment on microclimates. So I'm a bit of a weather nerd. I don't expect you to be as interested in it, but it's important to understand how our microclimates work because they very much affect how you can garden around the Bay Area. So our climate is called a Mediterranean climate. So it's like the climate in the Mediterranean Sea. And a Mediterranean climate is characterized by hot, dry summers and mild, wet winters. Okay. So what does that mean for you as a gardener? Well, it means a couple of things. One, it means you can grow vegetables pretty much year round. And two, it means that you have to irrigate in the summer because it doesn't rain for 6 months out of the year. And it can be confusing to be a gardener here because you get those seed packets and they always talk about plant before the last frost or after the, plant before the first frost, plant after the last frost. None of that applies out here, okay? Because we almost never get a frost. So we have the ability to garden around the seasons, but as we'll explain in the talk, things change for sure from season to season. So if you look at this map, you'll see that our climate is influenced by this cold current, the cold California current that comes down the coast of California. Our water temperature is generally in the 50s, in the low 50s in the winter, the high 50s in the summer. And that has a huge influence on our climate. If you look around the world at other places that have similar currents, you see Chile and the west coast of South America. You see the west coast of Southern Africa, the Cape, and you see the west coast of Australia. And what's interesting, what's notable about that is that they have very similar climates to our climate here. So things that grow well in those parts of the world grow well here. Now, this is a satellite photograph of our beloved marine air or fog that develops in the summertime. We also call it nature's air conditioning. And you can see it here kind of pushing up against the coast. There's the San Francisco Peninsula there. This is the bay in here. Here's Monterey Bay down here. Now, why do we get this? Well, the ocean is cold. The inland air is warm in the summertime. And so the cold air wants to move to where the hot air is. And the hotter it gets inland in the Central Valley in here, the more that cold air wants to come in, okay? So that creates this constant pressure of cold, moist air coming towards the center of California. However, as you see from this hand-drawn map from Golden Gate Gardening, there's this range of mountains that run down the peninsula from Loma Prieta, which is the L in the south, to Mount Tam over here in the north. And so the cold air is looking for the gaps to come through the mountain range. And the biggest one is this one right here, the Golden Gate, which is why on a typical summer afternoon like today, at this time of day, the wind is blowing 25 miles an hour and it's about 55 degrees in the Golden Gate, okay? The other places where the air will come through, depending on how high up that marine air goes, is the San Bruno Gap, okay? Notably, it was at the eastern end of the San Bruno Gap that San Francisco built Candlestick Park, which was why it was not a good place to build a sports park, and it was so windy out there. And then the other place is Crystal Springs Gap, which is where Highway 92 goes through the mountains. So these are the places that get very windy on a summer afternoon as the cold air comes blasting through. And what happens is the cold air comes blasting in the Golden Gate and heads down the bay. So in the summertime, you have cold air at the coast, right? So the coldest areas are, Paula was telling us about Northern Pacifica being very cold and foggy today. But then the marine air also brings some cooling to the bay shores, okay? So this is, I did a snapshot a few years ago of a typical summer's day in the Bay Area, and you can see the temperature spread across the map with the 60s on the coast and the fog and the 70s along the bay shore. Interestingly enough, as you go inland on the peninsula away from the bay, it gets warmer. So this is kind of our banana belt in here. If any of you have been to Filoli in Woodside, that is right in the middle of the banana belt, which makes it a great area for fruit trees. So typical summer afternoon like today, it's easily 10 degrees warmer here than it is over on the coast side. And then of course it gets quite hot inland. So there was a hot day on Tuesday, and I looked at the weather map. It was 56 degrees in Land's End. It was 105 degrees in Livermore. So 50-degree spread. So what that means is that in the summertime, what you grow is dependent on where you live in the Bay Area. If you're on the coast, you're going to have a very difficult time growing the heat-loving summer vegetables. So you're going to need to grow tomatoes that are cool weather tomatoes, like cherry tomatoes, or there are specific varieties well adapted to cool climates. Same goes if you're in the fog belt of San Francisco, which is basically the western half. And then you're not going to be able to grow eggplants, peppers, etc. But the more you come over the hill and come into the warm regions, the better able you are to grow warm weather vegetables. So these are the famous sunset climate zones. And you can see this number 17 is the one that has the influence of the marine air. So it's the coastal region. Some 90% of the Brussels sprouts sold in the United States are grown in San Mateo County on the coast side because it's the perfect climate for them. And then the marine air does, affect the narrow bayside here. And then as you move inland there, you get into slightly warmer climates, including what I said, the banana belt, which runs here sort of right at the base of the hills of the Santa Cruz Mountains. Okay, so you're here to talk about fall planting. This is a photo I took of my garden at this time of year. And the reason I include it is that your vegetable garden may look like this right now. It's just completely overgrown. You're harvesting a lot of stuff. And so it seems kind of weird to think about fall planting. But the reality is, as a vegetable gardener, you need to be thinking ahead all the time, a couple of months ahead, because if you're going to be harvesting vegetables, then you need to be planting them now. And so you always need to be thinking ahead. And the reality is, if you want a fall crop, this is the time to be planting it right now, even though your summer garden is in full flower, okay? So because of our marine air influence and the persistent fog bank that we get, people talk about gray, May gray, June gloom, no sky July, and Fogust. So the summer is the coldest time of year in San Francisco. And that pattern breaks down in the fall. And so it turns out that climatically speaking, late September, early October are actually the warmest times of the year. And that's particularly true for San Francisco and Northern Peninsula. So it's a great time for growing stuff, but daylight is shortening, okay? And plants like daylight because plants photosynthesize and they need direct sunlight to photosynthesize. Your winter crops and cover crops need to be planted by the end of October. So your fall crops would need to go in now or very soon. Your winter crops, and that might include a cover crop, need to be planted by the end of October. And that's not so much because of temperature, but because of daylight hours. So what that means is, if you have a small space for vegetable gardening, and most of us do here in the Bay Area, you're going to have to make choices. Do I want a fall garden? Do I want a winter garden? Do I want to go grow cover crops? Okay, because you probably can't do all of those things together. This is a planting calendar. We have 3 of these planting calendars on our website. They were compiled by one of our master gardeners, Carol O'Donnell. We have 3 versions of this, okay? It says up here, sunny areas. We have one for what's called foggy, okay? That would be the fog belt, essentially the coast, San Francisco, San Bruno, Daly City. Then we have what's called hot, which is the southern part of San Mateo County, San Carlos, Redwood City, Menlo Park, etc., Atherton. In between those two are what we call sunny. San Mateo, Foster City, maybe San Carlos, Belmont for sure. So you can go to the website, choose the one that works for you, depending on where you are. I've chosen sunny because it's kind of in the middle. We also have Spanish language and Chinese language versions of these. So if you look at August, we're midway through August and September. T refers to transplants, S refers to seeds. So it's too late to plant the summer vegetables, okay? No more corn, tomatoes, beans, peppers, eggplants, cucumbers, etc. There are basically three groups you can plant now. One is the root crops. So beets, carrots, parsnips, radishes, etc. The root crops you always want to plant from seed. They don't transplant well. Then we have the leafy greens. So lettuce, mustard greens, spinach, Swiss chard, etc. You can plant those either from seed or from transplants. Some of them are a little fussy on transplanting, so and they tend to germinate quickly. So it's generally best to plant those from seed. And then the third category is what we call the cruciferous vegetables or the cole crops, and that's your cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts family. And those you generally want to transplant into your raised bed or garden bed. They do better from transplants than they do from seed. So you'll notice those things always are going to say T next to them, okay? So those are kind of your three options right now, those three groups, and they'll all do fine. And that's not going to vary that much from foggy to sunny to hot. You might have a little more planting time in the hot areas, but generally those are your options for planting at this point. Now, you can grow vegetables through the winter here. This is a photograph of kale with snow on it. Kale and peas can actually take a frost, but a frost is pretty rare in San Francisco and San Mateo counties. A freeze is really rare. And so you can grow a lot of vegetables through the winter here. It's not a temperature problem. The problem is a daylight problem. So they're not going to get a lot of daylight on, a month to a month and a half on either side of the winter solstice, which is December 21st and is the shortest daylight time of the year, okay? So they'll just, as Carol O'Donnell says, you'll basically have a big refrigerator out there. They won't die, but they're not going to do very much. They'll just kind of sit there until the daylight hours pick up, and then they'll start growing again. And the problem in winter is not necessarily the shorter days, because our days don't get that short here in the Bay Area. I mean, if you go up to Seattle, their winter days are really short, okay? Our winter days, we get 10 hours of sunlight. The problem is the sun angle, okay? So this is a chart showing the sun angle through the year at 40 degrees north latitude, which is basically where we are. And you can see that at the equinoxes, March 21st, September 21st, the sun rises due east and sets due west, but it tracks south of vertical to 53 degrees above the horizon. And it's very easy to figure out what an angle like that is like. All of our phones today have the capability to measure an angle. At the summer solstice, you can see the sun rises in the northeast and sets in the northwest. and does this long arc slightly south of vertical to 76 degrees above the horizon, which is quite high. And then what you can see that December 21st, the angle is really low. It only gets up to 29 degrees above the horizon. And what that means is that the sun is going to get blocked by trees, by houses, by fences, etc. And so while we may have 10 hours of daylight, a lot of those hours of daylight aren't getting through to your vegetables unless they're really exposed somewhere. So that's the real problem in the wintertime. It's the lower sun angle. It's the lower intensity of the winter sun. Add those things up, they amount to much less energy for the plants, much less solar energy going into the leaves, building sugars that they need to grow. Okay, so that's the challenge in winter gardening. And that's why your plants aren't going to die from cold, but they're just not going to grow very much. Now, you know, like I said, you know, many herbs and so first of all, down here, so all these things are going to grow just fine, but very slowly throughout the winter, okay? A couple of things that just love the winters around here. Arugula is a notorious cool weather crop. If you've tried to grow it in the summer, you've seen that it doesn't last very long. But in the winter, it's really happy. So arugula does great here. Cilantro is another one that's notorious for disliking heat. Cilantro does great over the winter. And I've grown all these things just fine through the winter. Just don't expect bumper harvests. Now, there are a lot of things that'll die back in the winter and then come back in the spring. Most of your herbs, except basil and parsley and cilantro, are perennials. So they will come back year after year. I'll have another slide later on what to do with your perennial herbs in the winter. Peppers will come back, and rhubarb and asparagus, those are plants that actually prefer a freeze. Like rhubarb dies back completely to the ground, under the ground in the winter, disappears completely, and then reemerges the next spring. Asparagus does the same thing. Herbs in the winter. So most herbs are perennial. A lot of the herbs are woody, by which I mean, see these stems here on this culinary sage. It's very woody. And that may remind you of other herbs like rosemary, lavender, lemon verbena. If you grow lemon verbena, they're all woody at the base. And so in the winter, you can let those things grow through the winter. You can continue to harvest the leaves and everything. But it's actually better for them if you prune those back very hard to the woody base. And you can prune them really hard, and they'll come back just great the next year. And if they get old and too rangy, what you do is you actually dig down and divide them in the roots and separate the plants, and then they'll each grow back. So in the winter, you want to prune those perennial herbs to their woody stems. Your leafy perennials like tarragon and sorrel will just, they'll survive, but you just don't prune them back. And then, as I said, basil, parsley, cilantro are annuals and need to come back. Then need to be replanted. Okay, so planting, seeds versus seedlings, what are the benefits of each? So seeds are cheaper, right? You can buy a pack of seeds for about $3. You would pay at least $3 for a 6-pack of vegetable seedlings. And you're going to get a lot more than 6 plants out of a seed pack. So seeds are cheaper. The other thing is that there are way more varieties available with seeds. So if there's a particular variety that you want to grow, that you like, then you're much better off planting it from seed. If you go to the nursery and buy seedlings, they're going to be carrying the most popular varieties. You may not find the variety that you like. So if there are particular varieties that you like, you kind of have to grow them from seeds, okay? Now, the downside of seeds is you have to plan much further in advance because you need to start them a good month or so before you transplant them outdoors. And it's just more work. You need to plant them, you need to keep them warm to germinate them, and then you need to gradually get them adjusted to the outside. So it's definitely more work. So seedlings is just easier, right? You can say, hey, I want some Swiss chard. You can run down the nursery, pick up a 6-pack, and there you go. Now, if you do buy seedlings, so let's talk about planting from direct sow by seed or transplant. So as I said, the cole crops, you really want to transplant into the garden. Same with tomatoes and eggplants. They're much better off started indoors, gradually exposed to the outdoors, and then transplanted. Direct sow, you want to do all the cover crop, the root crops, direct sowed, and then the greens and the legumes are kind of in between. But I will say that peas and beans and squash and cucumber are just super easy to germinate outside, and same with the greens. So there's not much reason to transplant these unless you're just behind the game and you want to save a few weeks, and I do that sometimes myself. If you do buy seedlings, resist the urge to buy the biggest pot, the biggest seedling. There's always this temptation to say, oh, I'm going to get the most plant, the most advanced plant because it's bigger. What you have to understand is that the roots of a vegetable are easily half as long or 2/3 as long as the stem, okay? And so if you've got a tomato plant like this or a basil plant like this, you just do the math and the roots are already constrained by the size of the pot that they're in. And that's what we call root bound, and the roots start to grow in on themselves. And when you transplant that, it's never going to establish a good root system because those roots are not outward going, they're inward going. So it's actually better to resist that urge to get the biggest plant and to get one that's a little better sized for the pot that it's in. The other thing I would say is if it's yellowing, that's an indicator of nutrient deficiency. It means that plant has been in the pot too long. It's used up all the nutrients in that soil. So you want a plant that's really dark green. And I often go by stem size, particularly with tomatoes. I'm looking for a good, thick, sturdy stem. All right, let's now talk about soil. If there's one thing I've learned as a master gardener, it's that the secret to growing healthy vegetables is healthy soil. And I would say 90% of successful vegetable growing is all about having good soil. We've learned a lot about soil over the years. And we're now learning how much soil is really a delicately balanced ecosystem with these fungi and bacteria that have a cooperative existence with the plants. And in particular, something called mycorrhizal fungi. And the fungi actually are interlaced with the roots of the plant, and they have a symbiotic relationship whereby the plant is creating sugars from photosynthesis, sending those down the roots, and they're being taken up by the mycorrhizal fungi. And the fungi, in turn, are releasing the nutrients from the soil, the NPK and so forth, into the roots of the plant. So there's this very symbiotic relationship. There's a wonderful book by Suzanne Simard, Finding the Mother Tree, where she basically went out and proved the existence of these relationships in forests, and just changed the prevailing wisdom about how we understand forests and how we understand soil. So we've learned that it's important to build up your soil. So have a good structure in the soil. That means have air pockets in there that water can collect in, that roots can expand into, and to have a healthy ecosystem of fungi and bacteria in there. So that means avoid chemical pest and weed control, chemical fertilizers. You never want to have bare soil. You always want to have something growing in your vegetable beds at all time, either vegetables or cover crops or something. But the minute you have bare soil, it's going to blow away, okay? You want to avoid walking on soil wherever possible, as that compacts the soil and compresses those air pockets in there. That's why if you do raised beds, you really never want them wider than 4 feet apart, because you want to be able to reach the middle of the raised bed without walking on the bed. And increasingly, we're learning to not till the soil, okay? Not turn over the soil. And when I started, I was like, Mr. Double Digger and doing a lot of tilling of the soil. And now I do almost none. And of course, the classic image we have of the Corn Belt in the Midwest is, these giant tractors tilling the soil in between crops. And they're losing 10% of their topsoil every year there. And increasingly, farmers there are learning to do what we call no-till, which is you disturb the soil as little as possible. So this is what we say: feed the soil, not the plants, okay? When you use synthetic fertilizers, and a synthetic fertilizer is a fertilizer made from minerals and chemical ingredients. So like Miracle Grow is a classic example of this. You're feeding the plant. You're giving a whole bunch of nutrients. It's going straight into the plant, and the plant is like, whoa, this is great. And, we call it cocaine for plants. So it just gives this jolt to your plant, but you're not doing anything for the soil. And so the minute the plant comes down from that high, there's no more nutrition for the plant. Organic fertilizers and compost are feeding the soil, not the plant. And then the plant over time is getting nutrients from that, from the organic components being fed to it by the mycorrhizal fungi, okay? So what that means is, use organic fertilizers where possible, feed your soil. Compost is wonderful. Always add compost to your soil, 2 to 3 inches at when I like to do it in the fall after I pull out my summer plants, and always cover your soil. Use a good mulch. Okay, this is straw in our garden education center in San Mateo. Straw makes a great mulch. Mulch can reduce the evaporation from the soil by about 50%. Okay, so it's really helpful. Use cover crops, which I'll talk about, and this idea of chop and drop. Okay, which means we chop up and put stuff on the top of the soil, and it gradually works its way into the soil, but we don't dig up the soil. Compost doesn't add a lot of nutrients to your soil. Now, a good compost is often will have some manure in it, such as chicken manure, horse manure, etc. That's a big source of nitrogen, but the composting process breaks that down, okay? So the actual nutritional value of compost is not great, but what it's doing is it's building organic matter into the soil, increasing those soil organisms. It increases the ability of the soil to hold water and to have good structure, okay? And that's going to give you great vegetables in the end. In terms of nutrients that you want to add in the fall, it depends on what you are growing over the summer. So there are what we call heavy feeders and light feeders. Heavy feeders mean plants that take a lot of nutrients from the soil over the summer. And pretty much all the warm weather vegetables are there: tomatoes, cucumber, squash, corn, etc. Okay. The light feeders are here. And then what we call soil neutrals are the legume family, the beans and the peas. The legumes actually fix nitrogen into the soil through little white nodules on their roots that are bacteria, until the pods form, and then they extract nitrogen. It goes the other way. So the legumes, if you're growing beans, they're kind of soil neutral. Okay. If you've been growing heavy feeders over the summer, and many of us do, that means you're going to need to add nutrients to your soil. They've been depleted by those vegetables. So the fall is a good time to do that. Let's talk a little bit about crop rotation as well. So this is a photo of tomatoes with Verticillium Wilt. There are two wilts, Verticillium Wilt and Fusarium Wilt, which are funguses that build up in the soil. And once you've got them, they're there for years. It's very hard to get rid of them. So the best way to avoid doing that is to rotate your crop families, if possible. Now, when I say families, these are the main crop families. Tomatoes are in the nightshade family here, okay? Your cucurbits or your cucumbers, squash, melons, etc. Cruciferous vegetables we talked about before. Those are the broccoli, cauliflowers, etc. Those are the main families. You want to try to not grow the same family in the same place year after year. Okay, most notably tomatoes. It's not always possible. It's a desirable thing, but it's not always possible because, again, we're all with small yards. And like in my case, I really only have like one bed, which gets enough sunlight for tomatoes in the summer. So I definitely run more of a risk there. You can get disease-resistant varieties. F1 refers to Fusarium wilt resistance, V1 Verticillium wilt resistant. Or you can grow more in containers where you can change out the soil every year or so. So in the fall, this is a good time when if you got to make a decision, okay? If you're going to plant a fall crop or you're going to plant a winter crop, you're going to need to pull out those tomatoes, okay? They'll happily go to November if you let them, but if you want a fall or winter crop, you got to take them out. And when you do that, that's a good time to rebuild your soil. So compost your old plants, only if they're not diseased. get a good 2 to 3 inches of organic compost, put it on top of the bed. For those of us in the peninsula, Linkso Garden Supply in San Carlos has some excellent organic compost. I go over to Webb Ranch in Portola Valley. I'm sure there's plenty of places over coastside where you can get good compost. And you can either turn it under the first few inches, or increasingly what I do is I just take a pitchfork, put it in there a few inches and kind of rock it back and forth and sift it in. This is the time to add some organic fertilizer if you've grown heavy feeders and you need to add nutrients to the soil. Now, an alternative way to add nutrients back to your soil is to grow a cover crop in the winter. And a cover crop is a way to add nutrients back into the soil. These are plants that by and large add nitrogen. So the most common cover crop are fava beans, and you can intersperse it with crimson clover, vetch, oats, buckwheat, etc. A lot of garden stores will have pre-mixed cover crop mixes that'll put a bunch of these together, or you can just get the seeds separately. If you do plant a cover crop, you basically need to get it in the ground by the end of October in order for everything to germinate and get high enough by the time you lose most of your daylight hours. So I'll plant my cover crops by the end of October. They'll get up to maybe ankle height or so by late November, and then they'll kind of sit there for a couple of months, and then they'll really take off. And by the time I cut those down in the spring, the fava beans will be more than waist high. So what you do is you wait until they flower, but before the seed pods form, because once the seed pods form, they start pulling the nutrients out of the soil. So you cut it off right at soil level. It's nice to kind of chop them up into smaller pieces. Just leave it on top of the soil. You'd be amazed at how much it shrinks in a week from dehydration. And it's what we call green compost. It just, those nutrients gradually leach their way into the soil. Okay, the last section before we get to everyone's questions is pest management. So I think as master gardeners, we get more questions about pest management than we do about any other topic. And we're doing a course in September at Linkso called What Went Wrong with My Summer Garden, where we're going to share disaster stories from master gardeners. And I've been collecting those, and probably the biggest category is pests, okay? So pests are a huge problem for everybody. Integrated Pest Management is a program of University of California Agricultural and Natural Resources. It's UC IPM. The URL's on the slide, and Kelly's got it in the chat window as well. What IPM is, as it says, it's an integrated approach, a holistic approach to pest management that tries to avoid dumping a lot of chemicals on your garden. So the first step is monitoring and identification of pests, okay? A good way to do that is to use the Master Gardener Helpline. You can take a photograph of your plant, attach it to an email, send it to us, and we'll give you an answer. If we don't know the answer, we'll send it off to UC Davis. But, you know, if you got holes in your tomatoes, you know, it could be rats, it could be squirrels. Well, rats are nocturnal, squirrels are diurnal. You know, check and see, is it happening at nighttime? Is it happening in the daytime? That's identification, okay? Do you have, you know, little sawed off edges on your lettuce? Oh, that's probably snails, okay? So it's identification first. Once you've identified the problem, then you can do habitat manipulation. You can remove potential rat nests. You can remove potential areas for snails to nest. You can go out and you can handpick your snails. You can place traps for your rats, etc. And then you can mimic, you can mimic nature, right? Nature over the years has evolved all these great techniques for dealing with pests, because various animals like to eat other animals, and insects like to eat other insects. So, try to do what nature does. Some companion flowers will attract beneficial insects. The classic example is with aphids. Aphids are a very common garden pest here, and lady beetles, also known as ladybugs, eat aphids. Okay, so if you can attract lady beetles, they're going to eat your aphids. Boom, there goes your aphid problem. Okay, so that's the idea behind IPM. If you go to the website, you can search by pest, you can search by plant to see what's bothering your plant, whether it could be a disease or an insect or a vertebrate or whatever. And then it will give you approaches to dealing with all of those things. In my last few slides, I just want to share with you some things that I do for pests that have worked for me. The first is floating row covers. So floating row covers are a synthetic woven fabric, very lightweight. It generally goes by the name of Agribond, and it lets in like 95% of the sunlight, and also moisture will get through. So like if it rains on top of this, it'll like drip through. And if you look at this, obviously you can see that this is going to keep out any vertebrate pests because they can't get underneath it. And it's going to keep out any insect pest as well. So there are different weights of Agribond. The heavier weights are actually used by gardeners in other parts of the country because they can heat up the area underneath them by a few degrees. And so they use them to extend the season back in other areas. We don't need that. So we just use the lightest weight as a form of pest control. So obviously you can't put this over tall plants like tomatoes or cucumbers or pole beans or something like that. And you can't put it over plants that need pollinators to fly in. So you can't put it over your zucchini or your cucumbers or your melons, right? Because you want the pollinators to get in there. But for leafy greens, it's great. And I put this over my leafy green bed. We have real problems with beet leaf miners in this area. In Swiss chard, they tunnel their way through the leaves. And so if you ever grow beets or Swiss chard and you see the papery nature to the leaves, those are beet leaf miners. And if you have that problem, floating row cover is a great way to go. For fruit trees, I've learned to use tulle. I've learned that no men, including myself, know what tulle is, but most women do because it's used in dressmaking. And again, tulle is going to let the light in and the moisture in, but it's going to keep your squirrels out. And so it's very easy to work with. You drape it over the tree, use binder clips, and bingo, keeps the squirrels out. They would absolutely strip this tree if I didn't have the tulle over it. I used to use the black plastic bird netting, and I hated it. It's terrible to work with. It destroys your plant. Tulle is easy to work with, and you can take it off and reuse it every year because it doesn't tear. So I've been recommending this to everyone I know for fruit trees. And then finally, for squirrel protection, I do use an electric fence. This is powered by a couple of D batteries. it is a very low voltage and it's not going to kill anything, but it's going to give them a little shock. And it's going to let them know that it's probably not a good place for them to go to. So it seems to work. It seems to keep my the squirrels out of my tomatoes and other vegetables. Okay, so now we can move to the questions. Kelly, anything you want to say?
I'd say go ahead with the pre-submitted questions. We're getting some other really good ones in, but I'd say go ahead and start with those.
Okay, we've got a little over half an hour, so I think we're in good shape.
I think so.
Okay, so first of all, can fall crops go all the way from fall until spring, or do they die down in winter? So I think we addressed that. Your fall crops are going to go right through the winter, and they're not going to die, but they're not going to grow very much because of the reduced sunlight. Do you need root pruning to keep herbs small in a pot, especially mint? Okay, key point about mint, gardener's error. I have planted mint and lemon balm, which is in the mint family, in my garden. Huge mistake, because they spread by underground runners and they go absolutely everywhere. So anything in the mint family, please grow in a container because it can't escape. It will grow down through the bottom of your container, you'll find. But yes, root pruning is a great technique to keep your herbs small in a pot. So anything like a mint or a woody herb, it's great to do the root pruning in the winter. Effective strategies for getting rid of rats. So rats love to make their nests in sheltered, cluttered spaces. Okay, so places with ivy, just a lot of brush, etc. So if you can clear those out, that helps. Fundamentally, the only thing I've learned to do is to set rat traps, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. If you do set rat traps, rats love to stay next to walls and sides of raised beds and so forth. They don't like to be in the open spaces. Okay, so if you're going to trap them, put them like right next to the side of your raised bed. I will just say that the rat and squirrel problem seems to have been getting much, much worse on the peninsula in the last few years. Because we're just hearing so much more about them. And I think there may be a couple of reasons for that. One is the drought. They're just desperate for food, and they're desperate for water. Like squirrels are eating things that they never used to eat before. The other thing is there's also too many of them, which is, I think, because they've lost some of the apex predators. I know where I live on the peninsula, we used to have a lot of hawks and owls, and now because there's less open space, there's fewer hawks and owls. And so because of that, the rats and squirrel populations have exploded.
So Jonathan, before you move on, I just want to jump in here. We have a question if you have experience with the high-pitched alarm to deter squirrels.
I have not used it. I've certainly heard it. And what I've read has been largely negative about it.
Okay.
That's all I can say about that. I don't know that there's a lot of research on it.
So just another related question. Someone was wondering about that battery-powered electric fence. where can you purchase items like this? And I don't know if we can suggest the brand.
So we can't suggest anything, but let's just say that it's from a very large online retailer.
Great.
And
I think we can all decipher that.
yes, yes. And they're not trivial to set up. Okay, you have to run the wire around, you have to have a ground, etc. But once you've done it once or twice, you sort of get the hang of it. Anything else, Kelly? No? Kelly, you muted?
Oh, sorry about that. No.
Okay.
Nothing related
So
to that still.
How can soil be amended and reused after summer crops for fall planting? I think we talked about that. So absolute number one is compost, 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 compost. Okay. And, you know, I would say a good 3 inches on top. Okay. And that's a good way to calculate how much compost you need. Okay. So 3 inches is 1/4 foot, right? So let's say I've got a 4x8 raised bed, which is a common size for raised bed. That's 32 square feet. And then I'm going to multiply that by 1/4 because I'm going to do it to a depth of 1/4 foot. So that now takes me down to 8 cubic feet of compost. Okay. And so that'll tell you that for that 4x8 raised beds, you want 8 cubic feet of compost. Okay. And there's 27 cubic feet in a cubic yard because it's 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. Okay. And a lot of times you'll find compost is going to be like you go to Linkso, it's going to be sold by the cubic yard, not the cubic foot. Okay. So that's just a good way to calculate it. So a good 3 inches or so of compost. And then, as I said, that's a good time to add organic fertilizer. That's what I do always in the fall, even if I'm going to grow a cover crop. I'm just going to put an organic fertilizer in there at the fall. In the fall, the fertilizer bag, they're generally granular. The organic fertilizers, you know, they're Joby's, Dr. Earth. Those are kind of the main brands you'll find in the nurseries. And the bag will always give you an application rate per cubic foot. So that's how you figure out how much of that. And so you do the compost, the organic fertilizer, you can either turn it into the first few inches of the soil, or you can do the rocking back and forth technique with the pitchfork. But I find that fall is the best time to do the compost application. In the spring, I'll generally just cut down my cover crops, leave them on top of the ground, but I'm generally not going to recompost in the spring. What helps rebuilding old garden soil? I think we kind of talked about that. Okay. What should I do to prepare the soil in my container for fall planting? So I used to think that you needed to replace your container soil every year. And now I'm learning that you can use it for a good 2 to 3 years, your container soil. So first of all, if the plant was diseased at all, you don't want to keep that container soil. You don't want to reuse it if there are any potential diseases in it. But assuming your plants were healthy, then you can reuse that soil, but the nutrients have all been pulled out of it in that container, okay? Because they're not attached to the general soil and pulling the nutrients out of there, right? So your containers, you always need to add nutrients to it much more frequently than your raised bed, for example. Your containers in the summertime, you want to be giving them an organic fertilizer like every 2 weeks. Whereas in your raised beds, you know, maybe every month or two. So you absolutely need to add fertilizer to your container beds in the fall. You can add compost in there. It's great if you're going to reuse that container soil, to add some compost to it, and you can just refresh it with some new potting soil. How do you protect seedlings from rodent nibbling? Agribond. I mean, pretty much, even for my larger, taller crops, I'm going to cover them with Agribond when I'm germinating the seeds, if I'm germinating them in the raised beds, or if I've just transplanted the seedlings in there. I'm going to cover those with Agribonds just to keep them safe while they're young. So for example, green beans, birds are notorious for liking bean seedlings when they're little, and they can absolutely destroy your bean seedlings. So if you cover them with Agribond until they're established enough and to survive that, then that's a good thing to do. So I use Agribond to protect anything I'm germinating outdoors, any transplants outdoors, until it's strong enough to survive anything. But yeah, I mean, the squirrels are always going to go out there and, you know, bury stuff. There's not much you can do about that. How does wind affect growth of vegetables? It's in our area, it's mostly a problem where you're getting the sea breeze. Okay, because for people on the coast or in San Francisco or near the gaps, that you get that cold wind coming through in the afternoon, and that can be rough on your summer vegetables. The other thing is, if you're near the coast, there's a lot of salt in that sea breeze, and the salt is definitely not good for the vegetables. So, you know, particularly on coast side, wind protection is important. And if you're, you know, growing anywhere near the gaps, like the San Mateo Highlands, are, you know, and San Bruno Highlands, it helps to have a wind shelter for your vegetable. Kelly, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think you've covered it. I mean, I am near one of the gaps, and I try to put, especially my summer vegetables, in the most sheltered spot that I have.
Yeah. Okay, how many hours of sun are needed? So generally for your leafy greens, 6 or more. They can get by with 4, but 6 is better. Your warm weather crops, absolutely 8+. Okay. And so, you know, this is the problem in the wintertime. How to protect from insects or night mammals or squirrels. I think we've addressed that. Floating row covers are great for both insects and night mammals and squirrels. You can try the electric fence for squirrels as well. How many hours of sun needed for fall vegetable garden? Kind of the same as the previous question there. So, you know, a good point, key point here is it really helps to go out into your garden and observe it at different times of the year to understand how much daylight it's getting. So, you know, try to go out there right around the summer solstice and just make a note. When does the sun hit it in the morning? When does the sun leave it in the evening? Do the same thing at spring or fall equinox, because they're going to be the same, basically. Just see, you know, how many hours of daylight they're getting, and then do the same thing around the winter solstice, okay? And that'll give you a sense for how many hours of sunlight you're getting in your garden. In my case, where my raised beds are, in the wintertime, the sun with that lower angle is blocked by a bunch of redwoods in my neighbor's yard. So they get very little sunlight in the winter. But then there's always a point, and it's after the spring equinox, and it's kind of somewhere in late April, I would say, where the sun is above those redwoods all day long. And all of a sudden, I get a lot more sunlight on my garden. So you need to get out into your garden and observe that. All right, how to grow vegetables in pots. So as I said, two things to think about with pots are, one, they're going to dry out much more quickly because there's less soil to contain the water. And they're also going to use up the nutrients more quickly. So you need to apply fertilizer more frequently, and you need to apply water more frequently. And if your vegetables are getting droopy in pots, that's a good sign that they need more water. I'm just going to close the door here, keep some of the noise out. Interested in portable raised bed project. I'm not quite sure what that is, but there are a lot of, great sort of, kind of instant raised bed products that I see coming out of the market. Raised beds and growing potatoes. I'm not a potato grower, but the key thing with potatoes is, not letting the sunlight get to them, keeping them buried. So you have to keep mounding the earth around them. And the master gardeners have done some wonderful demonstration projects with like large burlap sacks, growing potatoes in those. Recommendations for the coast, again, so we have our spring seedling sale in mid-April every year up at the San Mateo County Event Center in San Mateo. And we sell a lot of tomato varieties that are good for growing on the coast. And if you're interested, you should go early because they sell out really early. But basically, you're restricted to sort of cherry tomatoes and smaller tomatoes. Early Girl is a common tomato variety for the coast. But again, we were talking before we started the class about the banana belt in Pacifica. And you can grow all varieties of tomatoes in the banana belt in Pacifica, which is not that far from the coast. So generally on the coast, you're not going to be able to grow things that need extreme heat. So you're going to do great with leafy green vegetables. You're going to do great with root crops. And you're going to do great with the cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, etc. And you'll just need to go to the farmer's market to get your eggplants and peppers, unless you've got a greenhouse. Are there fall plants that won't thrive if, oh, I see. We're growing tomatoes, cabbage, broccoli, cucumbers, zucchini. Are there fall plants that won't thrive after planting after these? No, unless, for some reason there have been diseases built up there. There's a lot of heavy feeders in here, so you're going to need to add nutrients into your soil. Okay, so if you're going to grow a fall crop and not a cover crop, you're going to need to add fertilizer along with your compost before your fall plants. Protect my fall winter veggies from summer thrips outbreak. Not sure I know the answer to that. You can go to the IPM website and look up thrips and look for and look for suggestions for thrips. Where can I get my soil tested near Redwood City? Send an email to the Master Gardener Helpline. We maintain a list of soil testing labs, and we
Actually,
can
you
send
know
you.
what, Jonathan? I'll drop that in the chat right now.
Okay.
I will find that.
Okay. Yeah. So, a soil test is going to run you over $100. Just be aware. But we can recommend soil test labs for you. Which plants do well in above ground planters? You can grow anything in an above ground planter. But if you're going to grow something really big, like a large tomato, you need a big enough planter for its root system. So, the recommendation is like nothing smaller than a 5-gallon container for a tomato in a container, for example. And so, over time, when I bought fruit trees or things that come in 5-gallon containers, I save those containers. You always want to wash those out with a bleach solution in case there's any diseases on there. And then I turn those into containers, and I'll grow tomatoes in there. But, a large tomato is going to have a root system that goes down, 18 inches. So as long as your container is big enough, you can really grow anything in an above ground planter. Will squash grow in fall? We address that? No, not really. It just needs more sunlight, more heat. There's the term summer squash and winter squash. Winter squash is a misnomer. Okay. Summer squash and winter squash both grow in the summertime. They all need a lot of heat and a lot of sunlight. The winter squash is just harder, thicker skin squash that you can go put in a root cellar or basement or something, and it'll store for months, and you can eat it in the winter. And that's why it's called winter squash. But it grows in the summer just like your zucchini does. Fava planting recommendations, as I said, if you're growing favas to eat, then you want to grow them in the summer. But if you're growing favas as a cover crop, you want to grow them in the winter, and then you want to cut them down before the fava beans themselves grow. Cover crops, we talked about that, when to plant before the end of October. How do they fit in with fall plantings? That's a great question. I mean, I've kind of treated it as an either or, that I sort of either cover crop a bed or I'll do a fall crop. But, you probably could do them both in the same bed, and when your fall veggies are mature and you're harvesting, then your cover crops will be coming up between them. I could see that might be possible. So you could always try that.
So actually, Jonathan,
more questions now?
we have a more specific cover crop question that I'd love to follow up with. So this person planted flowers in their raised beds this summer, and they're going to clear them to make room for fall seeds. So should they chop and drop those flowers, or is chop and drop only appropriate for cover crops?
So in the old days, I would have pulled them out. And now I do chop and drop. Because once you chop, the root system will die. Because there's no photosynthesis going on the plant. And so that the root system will die, and it'll become organic matter, which is no different than your compost. So I would chop and drop.
So something I just wanted to add to that too is some people do use flowering plants in their cover crops also. So, wildflowers and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes flowering crops are cover crops.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so we're at about 5:18. I'm going to try to get through some of these last questions we have here. I'm going to start with kind of what to plant and when questions. And the first one is, can you grow rhubarb in San Francisco successfully?
You can try. So I try to grow rhubarb here in Menlo Park. As I said, rhubarb actually wants a freeze in the winter, and you are just never going to get a freeze in San Francisco. So, if you go online and look up Google images of rhubarb, there are these giant rhubarb plants. They're all growing in the Midwest, okay, where they get, freezes in the winter and just super hot, humid summers. And that's what rhubarb is happiest with. And so I get a little bit of rhubarb here, but it's just not the right climate for it. And I think San Francisco is even a worse climate for it. I mean, you can try, but it kind of wants a colder winter and a warmer summer.
Okay,
And that's a real bummer because I love rhubarb.
All right. The next question is, do you still need to water plants that die back in the winter, or are they fine on their own?
They should be fine on their own, So again, it depends. If you're talking about plants that die back in the winter, they're fine. They're fine. If you're talking about your winter vegetable crop, if it doesn't rain for a few weeks, as has happened in the last several winters, then you do need to water, okay, to keep those vegetables alive. But as far as the perennial things, like the perennial herbs and stuff, no, those are fine with no water in the winter.
Okay. Now, this person is asking for some planting strategies. Can you explain how to plant the seeds for fall veggies like radishes in a garden bed filled with summer veggies, similar to the photo that you showed? Do they just sprinkle the seeds amongst the existing tomatoes and wait for the tomatoes to die?
So I really try to maximize the production from my raised beds by not having any downtime in the garden. And so what that means is planting the next set of stuff while the current set of stuff is growing and mature and I'm harvesting it. Okay. So for example, I have one bed and I'll grow Swiss chard there over the winter and into the spring, and then I'll plant the beans in between the Swiss chard rows. And then, the Swiss chard will be there, and all of a sudden the beans will start to come up in between the Swiss chard. That's kind of the same idea with what you're doing with your radishes, is you want to plant them in between your existing rows of vegetables, if you have rows in there. Now, you always want to make sure that once they germinate, that they then get enough sunlight to grow properly, which they can't do if they're just completely shaded by the existing vegetables. So does that make sense?
I don't see a follow-up question
Okay.
yet. So, okay. How about what are the most effective ways to save water when gardening?
Best is don't water, but that's not practical.
Compost and mulch.
Yeah, compost and mulch, because compost improves the soil structure and its ability to retain water. Mulch, as I said, can reduce your evaporation by 50%. We in the Master Gardeners really promote drip irrigation. So if you're hand watering, so first of all, you always want to irrigate early in the day, preferably before sunrise, because evaporation is lowest at that time of the day. So never water in the afternoon because evaporation is very high. If you're hand watering from a sprayer on the end of a hose, roughly half of that water is going straight up and not going to your plants. Okay, it looks like it's going to the plants, but there's a whole bunch of it that's just getting sucked into the dry air. So drip irrigation, remember I said feed the soil, not the plants? Same applies to water. Water the soil, not the plant. The water doesn't go into the plant. The water goes into the soil, and then the root of the plant gets it from the soil. Okay, so you want to send the water to the soil, and that's what drip irrigation does. Is it sends the water directly to the soil. So you need to water much less with drip irrigation than with hand spraying. Now, drip irrigation is not necessarily easy or problem-free. It's a lot of work to get it installed. They tend to need a lot of maintenance, for example, but I've used it for years, and it is a huge water saver. The last thing I'll say is I recently switched from my old irrigation zone controller to one of these smart zone controllers, and they have the ability to adjust your watering based on time of year, weather, etc. So I had set all the zones and it was happily watering away. And then I got an email one day that says, "Hey, Jonathan, we just reduced your watering by a quarter based on the time of year." And so that's a great way to save water. Those smart irrigation controllers will do it for you.
Great. And we actually had a master gardener in the audience suggest collecting water using water barrels also. So that's on the collection end.
Yep.
Okay, so moving into some questions about pest management. Just a real quick one, maybe sources for tool. I suggested, craft and fabric stores, but I don't know if you have.
Fabric stores, absolutely fabric stores. You go online, you can find them in fabric stores, and they sell it by the bolt, which is a nice, it's a 10-foot width or something like that. It's a really nice size for draping over the tree. Yeah. And, like with everything else, there was a massive supply chain shortage with tool at the beginning of 2022, and absolutely couldn't find it anywhere on the internet. But I think that's over now.
That's good news. How about bird pest control? Do you have any hints for general bird pest control?
Again, floating row cover is going to keep the birds out. Just any kind of netting, right? I mean, you go down to the berry growing region in Watsonville, and those things are completely enclosed there for bird protection. Do you have any ideas?
Just those. It's, exclusion. So anything that you can cover them with.
I've tried bright, shiny objects and stuff like that, and none of it worked.
I think they get used to things pretty quickly. So yeah. Okay. I
even had a crow. I had a tear in my Agribond over one of the raised beds, and the crows started ripping off Agribond, and I assume they were using it for their nests. So, yeah.
Yes. Okay, and now how about gophers and moles? How to mitigate gopher and mole problems? Is there anything other than paving over everything to tackle gophers? Because someone mentioned that they've actually had problems with them coming through gopher wire baskets.
Ooh, okay. So So number one, if you build a raised bed, you always want to dig down underneath the raised bed before you put any soil in there, and line that with what we call hardware cloth, which is it's a half-inch square strong wire mesh. Okay, and you line the underneath, okay, to keep the gophers out from the raised beds. If you forget about it and have to retrofit a raised bed, it's a real annoyance because you got to take all the soil out. So if you're building a new raised bed, absolutely line it with gopher wire. So moles versus gophers. Moles aren't interested in your plants, right? Moles are interested in insects that are in the soil. They will do collateral damage to your plants while pursuing those insects. But I tend not to worry about them. Gophers are after your plants, and they will do major damage. They're a particular problem over on the coast side. You can, again, line all your raised beds with hardware cloth. You can put wire baskets around trees or individual plants. And then it's just down to trapping. And, if you go to our website, Janice Moody is one of our master gardeners. She's sort of our gopher expert. She's got a gopher trapping video up there. My brother-in-law over in Half Moon Bay was telling me about some new whizzy gopher trap that he's been using over there. So it's mostly trapping with gophers.
Okay, I think we've got about 7 questions left. It's 5:30. I don't know if
I'm happy to continue, if people want to stay on.
Okay, yeah, Paula, if we're okay, we're gonna press forward.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, great. This is a nice, I think, pretty easy question. What works well to treat aphids?
Lady beetles are the best. So here's a key thing about aphids. We all get aphids around here. So aphids want the moisture out of the leaves of your fruit trees or your vegetables. And so they go to the underside of the leaf because that's the side where the water capillaries are running, taking the water up from the stems. So they're always going to collect on the underside of the leaves. And so you'll see that. You'll see like these little white clusters on the underside of the leaves. But the evidence you get of the aphids is the residue they leave behind, the black sticky stuff that we call honeydew, okay? That is aphid excretion or aphid poop, basically. But water is gonna, just a blast of water is gonna solve most of your aphid problem. If you have a hose sprayer, a lot of them have like a horizontal setting, which just does a horizontal spray. So you take that and you spray the underside of the leaves and just blast them off, once a day, a few times a day. And that's probably good enough because the aphids aren't going to kill your plants. They're going to damage some leaves for sure, but the plant is probably going to survive, or the fruit tree is generally going to survive. So, if you can attract lady beetles, that's great. A lot of times people buy lady beetles, they release them and they disappear. They go someone else's garden. So, just a blast of water will do a lot of the work on aphids.
Okay. This is an interesting little question. Someone has a cherry tomato in a container that's forming fruit. They saw a few small black mushrooms in the soil, smaller than the size of a pencil eraser, are they dangerous? They died and they haven't seen them recently.
No, I mean, I'm not a mushroom expert, but
Me neither.
most poisonous mushrooms are not that color. They're
Yeah.
very brightly colored.
Yeah.
I would just pluck those mushrooms out.
And, you know, mushrooms really
Okay.
are like the fruiting bodies of fungi, and a lot of fungi is actually really beneficial to your soil. So I'm actually kind of happy when I see little mushrooms pop up here and there.
Yeah.
But you can, you know, try to identify it using, I'm not sure if using IPM has a lot, but oh yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So I recently became fan. It was called iNaturalist. It's now called Seek, SEEK, and it was developed at the California Academy of Sciences. And you basically focus your phone's camera on a plant or an animal, and it does a remarkably good job of identifying that. It's my new favorite toy. The other thing I was going to say is, you know, fungi generally like moist environments, right? So if you've got mushrooms growing in your tomato container, you may be overwatering that tomato.
That's true. So, you know, there are a couple of other pest questions that I think are a little bit difficult because ID is really important for us answering questions. So I would say for the people who have questions about little white dots on their tomatoes and little white and black flies, to maybe go to the UCIPM website and use the plant diagnostic tool. I just used it this afternoon. It's really fun. And try to identify the pest, and or it may actually not be a pest even. Try to identify what it is that you're seeing and submit a question to the helpline. And, you know, we can also help maybe confirm an identification and then look at strategies if you do in fact have a problem. So I hope that's helpful. Sorry, we won't be able to answer maybe those specific questions, but hopefully that's, you know, good resources. Okay, this is one about volunteer tomato plants. So I have many tomato plants that started by themselves, but they're not producing flowers, or have flowers but no tomatoes. Will they actually produce tomatoes? And when do tomatoes stop growing? And do you need to cut them? Because these are in pots.
Yeah. So, you know, as I said, your tomatoes are, you know, they'll keep growing like till Thanksgiving if you let them. But the thing is, they slow down, and the tomatoes aren't going to ripen very much. And, you know, when I first came out here from the East Coast, you know, I thought, whoa, my tomatoes are going till November and I'll just leave them there. But, you know, now I know that you're kind of getting diminishing returns there. And at some point you just thank that tomato plant and put it into the composter and plant something new. In terms of the volunteers, we didn't really get into this, but there, you know, there are different types of seeds. There are seeds which are, you know, true to a particular variety, what they call open pollinated seeds. And then there's hybrids, which are crosses of different, of a couple of different varieties. And so, you know, one of everyone's favorite tomatoes, Sun Gold, the orange cherry, is a hybrid, okay? So just like a mule, a hybrid plant will not produce offspring that are true to type. So if your volunteers are coming from hybrids, first of all, you don't know what variety you're going to get from that volunteer, because it's not going to be the hybrid. It might be one or the other, but it's not going to be the hybrid, and it might just not be fertile at all. So that's the thing with volunteers.
Okay, and the last two are pretty specific, but what's your take on mulching and hugelkultur? Because someone is thinking about doing these.
What was it, the term?
Mulching and hugelkultur.
Hugel culture?
Yeah, it's
Mhm.
it's a it's a composting process that comes from, I think, a Scandinavian country or Scandinavia somewhere, where you start with a lot of very woody um, materials. So, branches, trunks,
Oh,
and things like that. Those go on the bottom, and then compost on top of that and plant into it.
oh, I see.
I say try it. We actually do have some Google culture beds at the Gardening Education Center in San Mateo, at the San Mateo Event Center. So if you're curious about that, come talk to us there. That's my take on Google culture.
Okay. And, if I could just, put in a plug for the Garden Education Center, there's some amazing stuff out there. We have like greenhouses and demonstration gardens, and we have all sorts of demonstrations going on there. And it hasn't been open to the public, because of COVID, and then because it was apparently not fully accessible. And we're remedying the latter. And so, I think the Garden Education Center is going to be open to the general public and restricted hours, sometime next year. And there's a lot of interesting stuff to see there.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. That's really great because it is a very nice place. And then just one last question here. Any advice on greenhouse or grow lights to use in the winter?
So here's the thing about photosynthesis. Nerd alert here. Light is on a spectrum, right? On one end is the red, and that's considered warm, right? You buy a light bulb for your house, and it's warm. It's more on the yellow-red side, and then on the cool side is blue. Okay, and what differentiates those things is the light is at different wavelengths, basically. Okay, and what's in the middle? The middle is green. Okay, so why are photosynthesizing plants green? Because they're reflecting the light that's in the middle, the green stuff. And so that's what you see. They're absorbing the stuff that's at the ends of the spectrum on either side, the red and the blue. Okay. So if you're looking to mimic natural light for your plants, then they do sell things that are called grow lights, which tend to provide a wide spectrum, which try to provide a wide spectrum. But you can also just buy like a light at the red end of the spectrum and a light at the blue end of the spectrum and accomplish the same thing. So, for example, you can get fluorescent light tubes, and some are going to be warmer redder and some are going to be cooler bluer. And you can get one of each, and then you're giving your plants the red light and the blue light.
So that completes the questions that we have from chat. I don't know if you want to go through your last few kind of resource slides.
Yes. Thank you for the reminder. So just want to acknowledge Paula from the San Mateo County Libraries for hosting us, and Kelly for being our question monitor. So we do have a monthly newsletter. You go to our website, you can sign up for the newsletter. You can see when the next Master Gardener training session is. You can apply for that if you want. We're always happy to receive donations to keep our work going forward. There's a lot of other good resources on our website. We have a lot of, videos, training classes, etc. And then, you will get this presentation, so you'll get this information, but the helpline is a great resource. And it's entirely free. You can visit us, or, if you visit us, you can bring samples, for example. But probably the easiest thing to do is to take a few photographs and attach them to an email. And you'll get a response pretty quickly from us. As you can see, we're not in every site every day of the week. So, sometimes it takes us a few days to get back to people, but I would very much recommend that you take advantage of that resource. And okay, I'll stop sharing.
All right, that was wonderful. Thank you so much.